Welcome to L&D Disrupt, the podcast dedicated to helping you overcome workplace challenges and prepare for the future of work today. I'm your host, Nelson Sivalingam, and I'll be speaking with the movers, shakers, and path breakers in L&D who are reshaping their organizations right now. Join us each week as we delve into the highs and lows of work in the industry to get to the real nitty-gritty stuff that you actually care about.
For those of you who've not joined L&D Disrupt before, it's a live podcast that happens every 2 weeks where we try and tackle big pain points for people in L&D, hot topics, things people are interested in, to give you tangible things you can take away and apply to your day-to-day L&D role or people role or HR role. This week, as you guessed from the title, I'm joined by the brilliant Hayley Brackley, founder of Great Minds Don't and Neurodiversity Specialist, to have that conversation about neurodiversity and L&D and how we can better support our learners, our people. So Hayley, I would love it if you could just give people a quick overview of who you are, your company, what you do, and any context that'll be sort of relevant for the conversation.
Thank you very much, Gary. So my background I always split into two, and one is kind of Hayley as the person and one is Hayley as the career. So Hayley as the career is much more simple. I'll cover that off really quickly. My background was much of my career was spent in emergency services. I hopped around, did a few different bits and found my way into the world of L&D and was like, oh my word, this is like going to work and not actually having to do any work because it's all fun stuff. Like, it's all really awesome. And having done some roles that were very linear and very, dry, and you must follow all of these rules, to then get into L&D and be able to just talk and smile and help people and all of those kind of fun stuffs, I just thought it was brilliant. So I got into that world and spent a lot of time learning about facilitating. Really, it was a very small organisation, so really kind of that in at the deep end. You need to be able to do everything and some, and maybe put somebody else's job hat on at the same time because you're covering, can you just pick that up because they're off? And so absolutely brilliant experience. Moved into a head of learning role, realised that head of learning meant an awful lot of paperwork and not a great deal of the smiley, chatty stuff. Moved back out of the head of learning role, moved into learning consultancy, and then following redundancy, launched my own learning consultancy, Great Minds Don't. And the Great Minds Don't comes from Great Minds Don't Always Think Alike. And the reason that's so important to me is because for all of my life, I was told that, there's a way to think. And actually, as somebody who is neurodivergent, my brain doesn't work in the way that the majority of people's does. And so I guess that leads me nicely into the kind of second part of the introduction, which is me as the individual. So I was diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia 21 years ago. At the point that I was diagnosed, it was really uncommon. I was the first girl that my psychiatrist had ever diagnosed. Nobody really understood what the effects of medication on a girl going through puberty were going to be. It just wasn't something that had been discussed. And so it was all a little bit like, well, we'll try it. We'll see what happens. I had support groups and they were full of boys who were, well, let me tell you. So the first session, we were in a room with chairs. The second session, they took the chairs away for our safety so that nobody could throw them. The third session, we moved to a different room that had bars over the window, again, for our safety. And the next session, I don't know, because I begged my psychiatrist to please let me do anything other than have to go back. And that gives you a bit of a picture of kind of the way things were. That was our demographic of people with a diagnosis at that point. As I mentioned, I went into the emergency services. I had a really interesting and varied career. Unfortunately, one of the things that did happen was I had a really poor relationship with one of my managers, really not particularly inclusive, very toxic situation. And I ended up having a mental breakdown on the back of it. My recovery was facilitated through an amazing psychotherapist who prompted me to then train as a therapist. And then I got into the world of L&D and thought, the coaching, the training, the therapeutic background, bringing all of that together really is where the kind of sweet spot is. And so then taking that into the world of neurodiversity and neurodivergence and helping people to understand how their brains work differently and how other people's brains work differently, because that's just as important. And interestingly, what then happened was in the last couple of years, I discovered I'm also autistic. And so when I was diagnosed, you couldn't have both. You could have either ADHD or autism. And so you wouldn't get assessed for both. And I very much kind of hung on to that. And even when the information around me had changed and I started to see more people being diagnosed with both, I was so convinced that I wasn't. And then I met more and more particularly autistic women and would listen to the things they were saying and think, oh, well, that explains a lot. And so does that, and 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 that. And then it got to the point where I was like, okay, basically, there's not really an alternative explanation for why I'm happy to have one friend here and one friend here, but never the two shall meet. And why I'm really happy to come and have a conversation today in front of 32 people. But if we were in a pub, I'd be the one sat really awkwardly in the corner, looking at a pint, trying to work out how I involve myself into conversations in an appropriate manner, and all of those other things. And so I've kind of added that into my kind of experience. So just to finish off, in terms of business and what I do, I very much focus on, much as I still do some leadership work, some personal development work, very much focus on neurodivergence and neurodiversity in the workplace, supporting workplaces to become more inclusive, supporting individuals to really learn to be the best version of them. Because, you know, when you grow up in a world that's built for the 80% and you're one of the 20%, you might need to relearn some stuff. And often that relearning comes as an adult rather than as a child, as may have happened for other people. And you know what? I was working with somebody that's in their 70s and had only just discovered that they were neurodivergent. And for their mum picking their life and the way that things had happened was amazing for them. And so I think that just really goes to show that actually this isn't something that's for people in their 20s or 30s or 40s. This is life. This is all of life, and this is all of us. Was that concise enough?
Yeah, so I really appreciate you being so open and honest, Hayley. I really appreciate that. And I think I've heard that commonly from people who are in that adult life diagnosed with something. It's like that. This all makes sense now from backwards from that point. I'm aware that there'll be people listening, especially maybe to the recording, who are maybe new to this topic or just really curious. So I wanted to just read to you the most succinct stats and definition I could find, and then see for that extra context if there's anything you agree with, disagree with, or would add on to it. So I'll put the link to this in the show notes as well, the full article, but it says neurodiversity includes a range of conditions, including dyslexia, ADHD, and autism, and therefore affects around 18% of the population. Thinking, attention, memory, and behavior can all be different for someone who is neurodivergent. According to Neurodiversity Hub, which I think is more than a thing about education in this article, but 78% of neurodivergent people experience difficulty at their place of learning, with the main challenges being fitting in socially, that was 60% of people, learning difficulties, 55% of people, and communication difficulties, 51%. Anything in there that you would add on to, contest, think is maybe slightly off in that?
When we're talking about organic matter, we've always got to maybe let go of that desire to be necessarily quite so prescriptive. The 18%, I'm like, that's a fantastic statistic. Somebody's obviously done some research, but to what degree? So that would be the first thing I would unpick is just about being quite so precise. In terms of the word neurodiversity is a word that covers all of us. So it's not incorrect to say that it includes a range of conditions, but it also includes those who have absolutely no conditions, such as ADHD, dyslexia, or autism. And so that really is, if we think about ethnic diversity or biodiversity, it's everything. It encapsulates everything. And that's what neurodiversity does. You know, I always use the example that some people like corned beef. We definitely have different ways, different brains that do different things. Some of us like maths, some of us like English, some of us like talking out loud, some of us like writing things down. All of us think, feel, process in different ways. And that is that concept. Neurodivergence, that would be, and depending on which statistic, which study you look at, who's incorporating which differences into their percentages, generally we see between 15 and 20% as the quoted statistics. And that's people whose brain work in a way that is categorically different to the extent that it can be helpful to attribute a label such as ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, all of those. And so, yes, absolutely, thinking, attention, memory, and behaviour can all be different for somebody who is neurodivergent, but also somebody that's not. And that's what we need to kind of not forget. The other thing is that at the minute, our statistics really rely on diagnosis rates and awareness, which is something that has grown beautifully over the last 5 years and will continue to do so probably over the next 20 years, which means that we've not quite got all of that information yet. So again, another reason why maybe don't get too hung up on the percentages. There's so many people out there who don't know they're diagnosed, and if they also don't know they have a condition because they've not got a diagnosis. So they don't know, how do they fit into our percentages? So really what we want to be thinking is it probably is somewhere around 1 in 4, 1 in 5 of us have a brain that works in a way that's, helpful to categorize as being different in some way, until the point that we have an environment that allows everybody, in whatever way their brain works, to come and be their best selves and be included. And we have that knowledge of that systemic inclusion.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect framing for sorry, Hayley, you continue.
Absolutely fine. I was just going to pick up on this kind of second part that you gave around the difficulties. And absolutely, there are difficulties in terms of learning. But actually, if we looked at workplaces, things like fitting in socially, they're often, if somebody comes for coaching, I very rarely see somebody come for coaching because they've got difficulty spelling. It's normally, or some of the other kind of real common things, they've got difficulty reading because the colour's wrong on the background. Or actually, it's much more often about social challenges, well-being challenges, keeping themselves kind of mentally feeling good. Learning can be a massive, massive impact on that, but in both ways. If we can learn stuff, often we can make our world a lot easier around us. Whereas if we're struggling to learn stuff, that can have a detrimental impact. So I would say, much as they are statistics around learning, that's probably going to be a good kind of ready reckoner for any workplace as well.
Yeah, I think that's really good context for what we're going to discuss today, because it's more so about how do we make the experiences accessible to everyone. And like you said, everyone falls into that bracket of neurodiversity. So it's about the two things, isn't it? It's improved, actually, let's just move straight into that next talking point. We talk a lot of time about culture. Some of the stuff you spoke about alluded to it there, but the culture is made up of the things we do every day. And this is really a way we can create a more accessible environment to people to support our neurodivergent teammates. So what are some of the things that we can just start doing every single day at work to make a more accessible workplace for everyone?
I think when we look at culture overall, and I'm going to go into sort of the more tangible specifics in a moment, but when we look at culture overall, what are we getting hung up on? What assumptions are we making? What arbitrary rules have we got in place? What ridiculousness have we got in place? Have we got processes that mean that somebody has to go and click there and click there and click there and click there? Oh my word, that's exhausting for anybody. But for somebody who's dyslexic or has ADHD, that's even more awful. And so thinking about the culture that says, do you know what, we're not perfect, but we're going to try and make it good. We're going to listen to people. We're going to take stuff on board. We're looking at what you produce, not necessarily how that's done. Actually, we want you to do a good job. We don't necessarily need you to tick every single red box and hurdle every piece of red tape that we can throw at you. And then the culture that says, and one of the things I always say is, my reality is not your reality. It never will be. Your reality is not my reality, and that never will be. You don't have to necessarily understand my reality in order to accept it. And so all of us in our work environments, in our life, we can seek to accept somebody else's perspective, knowing that actually we may never understand it. We've not lived that life, and that's okay. It's okay for us not to understand every single nuance of other people. But what we then need to do is to actually say, what's going to help you to have your best day at work? How can I help you to facilitate that? So that's the higher level stuff. Let's get into some of the more tangible things. So if we think about learning environments, death by PowerPoint, that's a great place to start. Those slides where the person's had to put it into like size 8 font because they really wanted to get everything onto one slide, and they've rammed it in, but it's okay because they've used some bullet points. And each bullet point is 67 sentences long. Yeah, Rosie's there with me. Rosie's not enjoying this experience either. I can tell from the face. Just don't do that. I mean, if that's a starting point for us, what's the opposite of 67 sentence slides? that's going to be a really, really great place to start. There was, I don't know if you saw it, but kind of perhaps just pre-COVID, I noticed a trend of, really demonizing PowerPoint. We shouldn't have slides because there's nothing wrong with having slides. They're great for adding context. They're great for giving something visual. They're great for putting succinct points on. And as a facilitator, they're also great if, there's words that you might get back to front. They're great for giving yourself that prompt and putting them out there. But they're not a book. They're not designed to go up as something for somebody to read. So use them as that. Use them as aids. Don't clutter them. Think about things like contrast. So if you've got green and red together, actually some of your learners are just simply not going to be able to read that overlay. If you are presenting virtually, then a white or off-white background is great because that person can then use whatever overlay works on their own screen at home to get the right kind of colour for them. If you're presenting in person, I would really encourage you to go just off white. So we're not going for that real stark white against black, because even for somebody that's not neurodivergent, that can lead to headaches. But so those kinds of things, the kind of, thinking about literally the design of what you're doing. Then we're thinking about the wider design, the actual kind of, instructional design. What is it that you're trying to achieve? What is it that you want people to learn? Are you chucking in big, massive icebreakers? Because, that's the trend, isn't it? We should all have really off-the-wall icebreakers. But actually what you're doing is disengaging some of your learners who are perhaps a little bit more shy, not so up for communicating. You're disengaging them in the first 10 minutes of the course because you've put them on the spot and you've asked them to come up with 4 interesting facts about themselves with no context framing. And they're just sat there thinking, what is an appropriate, interesting fact that I can share? And I don't really want to talk in front of this group of people. So thinking of those kinds of things as well. Social environments, we get into the mindset sometimes that it's really good to get everybody talking to everybody. Well, yeah, it is if you're a really extroverted person and you enjoy talking to lots of people. But actually, if your safety net is knowing that the 2 people either side of you are going to be the people that you spend the majority of the day with, and that's going to help you feel calm enough and regulated to learn, then you probably don't need to talk to every single person in that room to get a fantastic learning experience. What's going to be more helpful is that you feel safe, you feel comfortable, you feel that you can advocate for yourself. You feel like you can just say to that facilitator, I might struggle to be moved around. And if we think about our environment, we need to make that acceptable for somebody. We need that person to come in and know that as a facilitator, you're on their side. And we need to give them that opportunity to say, whatever's going to help you get the best out of today, let me know. And you can let me know. We want to be asking this question before they're in the room, right? Whether that's a virtual room or a physical, actual room with walls. We want to ask that question beforehand. We then want to ask it as people are coming in. And we probably want to ask it 10 minutes in. And do you know what? If we're still there after lunch, we probably want to ask it again after lunch. Because ultimately, if we're facilitating great learning, we need our learners to learn. And if there's something we can do to help that happen, let's do it. Let's ask that question. And, there's not this, everybody always wants a flowchart, don't they? Hayley, give me a prescriptive flowchart that tells me if I do this and then do this and then do this, then every single one of my learners will be happy. There isn't one, because do you know what? You can do some really good practices and then somebody will come in and say, actually, for me, I want to sit over there. That's what's going to help me, is if I can sit over there. And that might not be part of your design. And then that's then about kind of, like I say, the culture, the environment, the social environment you create that allows somebody to come and ask.
Yeah. Yeah, to jump ahead a little bit, I think we were going to talk about this when we spoke maybe more about resources, but I think the feedback loops and when you create feedback loops really matters. Like so often we create something, hit publish, and then get back on the creation wheel. But actually, to your point there of live sessions or content you're creating, when are you asking people if this actually helps or something could be tweaked so it's more digestible for them? Do you see that as well, that there's maybe not enough feedback loops, and any more tips on sort of building those in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I used to do in kind of consultancy was train accredited leadership courses. And there you have huge amounts of theory to digest, and then you have to write about it in a, again, really I'm going to say it, a really bizarre manner. You've got to write about it very specifically, hitting certain points and referencing things in certain ways, which for some people is just not going to be helpful. And so actually this is what, I know I'm really controversial, I'm really pushing the boat out here, but that's what we kind of put up there as this, golden standard of accredited courses. And they're not necessarily the most inclusive of ways of doing something, because there's not the flexibility, there's not the opportunity to give feedback to say, actually, this could have worked a bit better for me if we did it this way. Because we've got so hung up on having consistency in assessment that maybe we've lost some of the validity. We're not actually checking that learner's understanding. What we're doing is checking that learner's ability to write an essay. And they're two very different things. So we absolutely need to have feedback loops. We need to have ways of people challenging, but more importantly, we need to have somewhere in that loop where it comes off the loop and comes into an action. And we need to have the space, the bravery, the courage, the desire to challenge what we've always done. Because do you know what? That's only going to get us what we've always had, isn't it?
Yeah, Hayley, we've got a couple of questions in the chat similar to this point as well. But one is, any best practices for collecting feedback? Would it be individual conversations, do anonymized forms? Is there anything that you see particularly works when it's gauging whether there are challenges people are facing or they might need help with certain things when it comes to learning at work?
All of them, all of the ways. I know it's a bit flippant, but genuinely, there's not going to be, I could say to you, make sure that you use Kirkpatrick model and go for some really good surveys. And that's going to work for some people, but it's not going to work for everybody. It might just be those little anecdotal conversations where you wander around the room and you say to somebody, how are you getting on? And they say, it's all gone right over my head. Actually, that's probably the most valuable feedback that you're going to get for that entire session you're running. And that's going to be so much more valuable than, a couple of happy sheets at the end where people are just ticking 9s and 10s because that's their habit to tick 9s and 10s. So there's not necessarily going to be a prescriptive, do this and then do this, but it's about the listening, it's about the tuning into it, and it's about the mindset of how can I make this a better experience for everybody that's in the room today and will be in the room in future. And I think if you can approach it from that mindset, whether you're doing a survey, whether you're having an anecdotal conversation, whether you are, going through a full QA process and pulling everything apart and analysing your results and all of those other things, all of them, you have to have that underpinning desire to make it the best it can be.
Yeah, and I think to come back to combine a couple of these points, one about things we can do every day, two about collecting better feedback. One thing we spoke about briefly before, Hayley, was providing clarity to people ahead of meeting. So what do we need, by when, and why? Like these sort of three things. And there's a great, actually, I'll drop the link in the chat in a second, but there's a great nano tips course. There's like 1 to 2 minute videos from someone called Ellie Middleton. And one of them is about this, but she's saying that obviously when people reach out to her and catches her off guard, her brain kind of struggles to process what's going on. And that means in a meeting, you won't get the best out of her, but by giving her that why, what, and by when framework ahead of time. And I think that also feeds into the feedback part of how are we going to know if this is useful unless we've got clarity around what the purpose is. So how important is that as well culturally, that our meetings are clear, we're not springing them upon people by phoning them out of the blue, we're providing clear structure.
Yeah, it is really important. And, that kind of, bringing in your W's into your conversation, I don't know anybody that's not going to find that beneficial. What a great way to run a business, to have that as just a standard way of working. If you're asking something of somebody, just give them this information. You don't need to go over the top on it. Just pop it in. So I think that's really helpful. In terms of meeting culture generally in organisations, if we think about things like the timings of meetings, yes, let's not spring things on people, but also let's not put in, important catch-up for tomorrow at 2:00 in the afternoon, and then somebody's going to be spending the next 24 hours thinking, oh my word, what is this important catch up that you're going to have with me? So there's going to be a balance. And, you know, some of that is going to be relevant to different people. And that's about knowing people around you. You know, I'm definitely not somebody that would want that sat in I would rather you give me, you know, here's a heads up of what we're going to discuss tomorrow. That's going to help me a lot more. Other people would rather just wait until the conversation and bring it in. And so we're only going to know that through communication with people. Meetings that go on forever, have breaks. Again, sounds really simple and really flippant, but particularly now we're working virtually, there's almost this weird like thing where we think people should sit still for 2 hours and keep concentrating and talking about the same thing, and it's a bit baffling. Whereas if we were face to face, we probably wouldn't have made it quite so long, and we wouldn't have gone around in, you know, the same circles. So keep things a bit more concise. Give people permission to leave when their bit's done. Again, you know, that's not just going to be for your neurodivergent colleagues. That's everybody. Who doesn't want to get out of a meeting that's got nothing to do with them at the point that they're done with it? Make that an acceptable way of working. Collaborate on agendas and notes, so you're not just relying on one person. I remember having a conversation with an organisation, and they were saying, you know, they were performance managing somebody, quite a junior member of staff, and I said, you know, let's talk about the way that it's working. And one of the things they were doing was expecting this person, because they were junior, to be the person that takes the notes in the meeting, which then meant two things. First of all, they weren't contributing any ideas. I mean, really? Are you surprised? The second thing was that often they weren't getting everything that they needed out into the notes. And I was like, this person's new to your business. They're actually new to the world of work. You know, it's a junior position, quite entry level. And yet that's where you feel is the most appropriate person, and you want them to be coming up with new ideas. But I think we've probably all seen that somewhere, where we don't necessarily choose the note taker because they're a fabulous note taker. We choose them because they're the junior person. They're female. That's something that I've experienced often. And then people only do it to me once because they see how naff my notes are and never ask me ever again. But, you know, that's another thing that comes up. And again, it's challenging yourselves. It's looking at what are we doing and why are we doing it? And is there a different way of us doing it? What assumptions are we making over and over again?
No, exactly. And I think a couple of the points you made there really hit the nail on the head, that if we're going to change these things, they really do benefit everyone. Like I didn't see anyone agreeing with their faces when you said about this surprise meeting coming in, or, you know, important meeting tomorrow afternoon, and then no context, and then you spend the whole night stressing out. Like, everybody hates that. The decluttered slides point from earlier, you know, everybody is going to benefit from a slide that just has the 3 things you need to remember, as opposed to, like you said, we're just getting the font smaller and smaller to cram everything on. So yeah, I think, is that part of the sort of framing of this conversation as well, that these changes that people need to make, if they think there's some sort of stigma or huge investment of time or money in making these changes, actually they're more small things that will benefit everyone, that come back to the day-to-day, right? Yeah,
absolutely.
We're going to move shortly into a couple of more content creation, live workshop, how you facilitate those sessions, questions in a second. But there was a good question in the chat about, well, I'll just read it verbatim because it'll better than me paraphrasing it. But in L&D, how do we try and understand what neurotypical people need? If we're neurodivergent, we think that our way is normal. So is there anything, have you ever come across that, or best ways to approach that situation?
I think one of the big things is that actually there's no one neurodivergent way of wanting something. So you could have 5 neurodivergent learners. One says, I'm dyslexic, so please don't give me anything in writing. The other one says, I'm dyslexic, but actually for me, my phonological processing is worse than my visual processing. So please do give me this in writing, because actually as you're talking, it's not going to go in. I'm not going to hold on to it. You could have somebody else that says, I have ADHD, and therefore the best way for me to concentrate is to be able to interact with you. You could have somebody else who's autistic, and I'm being really stereotypical to kind of help it make the point. You could have somebody that's autistic and says, actually, I would rather just listen. I don't really want to interact. And then you could have somebody else that says, well, I think I just need to be here and kind of do whatever we're doing. I don't think I've got anything in particular that's going to help me to do this in a particular way. And so all of those 5 people have asked for something very specific to each other. And so it almost comes back a little bit to, do you remember the VARC learning styles that we're all going to put in the bin because we've debunked it? But it comes back to the same kind of thing. There's not going to be a one way of doing something. And what we really need to be doing is thinking about, if we were to use VARC, let's use it absolutely and say that, you're a read-write learner, so therefore you'll learn absolutely everything by reading about it. But have you got some opportunities for people to read about it? Have you got some opportunities for people to look at it visually? Have you got some opportunities for people to interact and talk about it, to put it into practice, to give it a go? Have you got the opportunity for somebody to just listen? And if you bring in each of those different ways of learning, actually that's gonna kind of help. And then if we think about social environments, introversion and extroversion, everything about humans is on a bell curve in some kind of manner. If we think about each of those bell curves, where are we as individuals on that? And what's the rest of the bell curve looking like? What would we need to do to facilitate a space that's inclusive of everybody on that bell curve? And Michelle's put fantastic word in, universal design for learning, and that's absolutely it. What we want to be doing is ensuring that we have either, we can use the word systemic inclusion, which is systematically including every single person, or universal design, so a way of designing something that means that we look at all of those different bell curves, and wherever you are on that, actually this is going to be a decent experience for you. And universal design, generally speaking, will cover the majority of things we need to do. What we also need is the flexibility sometimes to say, yeah, okay, either I hadn't thought of that, that's not something that was in my kind of field of awareness, and add it in, or it might be something that is so unique to somebody that we then add that as an individual accommodation.
Perfect. Cool. Thanks, Hayley. I want to move on to, like we said, live sessions, workshops, webinars. These are still so typical ways we learn. If you can hear a lot of background noise, the man across the street from me is fixing his door at an inopportune moment, but hopefully there's not too much background noise. Yes, live sessions, workshops, webinars are all so commonly used still. And I think this is where what L&D teams can do meets that thing we spoke about with meeting culture. But how can you best run a live session so that it's accessible for everyone? Everyone gets clarity, everyone gets what they need from the sessions.
So thinking about before the session, what information are you giving people and in what format? Do they know exactly where to turn up to, what time, just the logistical stuff that's going to alleviate some of the stress? Have you asked them what they might need to make it a better experience for them? Is there anything optional that they can do beforehand? Do you have to have something mandatory that you're going to ask people to do beforehand? So think about that right from the very start. And then think about what information have you given them? So do people know what the running order will look like? Do they know when they're going to get their breaks? Do they know when their lunch is going to be? Do they know where they're going to have their lunch? Do they know if there's a fridge to put their lunch if we're talking face to face? If it's virtual, are we setting out an expectation of do cameras have to be on? Is it optional to have cameras on? Is it one of those things where you're going to turn up and nobody's camera is going to be on because you're just going to be sat there listening? Giving that kind of information up front. Is there flexibility about how people get to work? So like I said earlier, with group work, is it set in stone that people are going to be working in, this group and that will be it for the rest of the day? Or is it going to mix in between? And how will you communicate that with people? Do people know that that's what's going to be expected of them? Are you putting it out there up front that there will be discussions and that, if that's going to create challenges, let me know and I'll help to facilitate that. Sometimes I've seen where you can have breakout rooms for those with cameras on and breakout rooms for those with cameras off. And so what that means is that it just takes pressure off people. If people want to have an auditory only conversation because that works better for whatever reason, they can do that. Thinking of other things. Mine's gone blank.
No, that's all right. Good. I've got a follow-up question for you anyway.
Go for it.
One thing we've spoken about before is, in the light of that, what are we expecting to get from this session is how do we best help people prepare, or do we provide flexibility for how they consume the content afterwards? So my favorite example is, if we're going to be talking about what our new branding is, are there lists of logos people could look through ahead of the session, and then we're getting together? The point of the meeting is to decide together about what would we change, what wouldn't we change, and then do we need to make that decision in the moment, or is there flexibility for me to take that resource away with the logos, provide my feedback in a not time sensitive situation where I might feel pressured? So I know that was kind of coming from an angle of this will just work better for everyone, but do you find that mindset really supports people who are neurodivergent when it comes to learning and training as well?
It's an interesting one because it can support a lot of people. However, as somebody who has ADHD, if you sent me something and said this needs to be looked at before, chances are I'm going to forget that needed to be looked at before and not look at it, and then get to the meeting and feel a little bit like, or the training session, and feel a little bit like, everybody's talking about something that I've forgotten about, or I might kind of stress over it. So yes, do it, but with something that kind of gives the option. You can look over this beforehand. If not, we're just going to do this bit of a catch up so that we're not weighting it too heavily. I think the other thing is that it's that flexibility of time, and also flexibility. So with your specific example about brands and kind of offering feedback, the flexibility on time of when do you want to communicate? When do you want to absorb information? When do you want to communicate your thoughts? But also the how. So things like Mentimeter are a really nice way of people being able to just pop their contributions in without their name, without having to talk in front of people. You can add something, you can be engaged, you can be part of and you can choose. You can have that as a word cloud, you can have it so that it puts questions up. And so whether that's a meeting or a training environment, it gives that way of somebody being able to talk.
Yeah, I love that. It's more, let's not make one arbitrary mandatory thing swapped for another, like you have to look at this before the session, but here's the optionality, right? That's the best approach. I really like that mindset. Got a great question from Kurt in this subject in the chat, but it's, how can learners support trainers preparing for a session? Is there any, obviously can be a two-way street, the feedback system, but is there anything you see working for learners helping their trainers prepare for sessions ahead of time?
So I think in terms of kind of self-advocating, letting the trainer know what's going to really help you, that can be a great one. There's always that curveball where somebody turns up on a session and says, actually, can I have everything printed on purple paper, please? And you think, I've got it on green and yellow and not purple. So that's one of the things. I had another thought and it's gone. Let me come back to that. I'll come back to your question. And I thought about the other thing that went a second ago. This is the way my brain works. Dolphin thoughts, I call them, because there's the thought on the surface and then it dips down and you don't see it for a little while and then it dips back up somewhere else, just like a little dolphin. In terms of environment and training, think about all of your five senses. So for many people who are neurodivergent, there's either a hypo or hypersensitivity to your five senses. And even the sixth sense as well. So that kind of social and environmental, emotional, all of those things into that sixth sense. So visually, we cover that one quite often. We think about the cluttered slides, we think about the contrast. Auditory. So how easy is it going to be for this person to process? Is there background noise? Are you in a room with a massive echo going on? Do you need to, if you're face-to-face, do you need to have a microphone? If you're not face-to-face and actually you're delivering virtually, have you got a decent enough microphone that people are going to be able to listen clearly? Are you putting everybody else on mute? Are you getting rid of those kind of echoes and whatnot? Are you choosing to put music on in breaks? And are you thinking about the kind of music that you're choosing and the impact that can have on people? Are you giving the flexibility about that? Smell. Generally, we're not going to have a great deal to do with that when it's virtual, because somebody's home smell is, or office smell is going to be that smell, and we're not going to. But in terms of the training environment, is there a really overpowering plug-in air freshener in the corner? You know, what impact's that going to have on people? Taste, again, it's not often that it's going to come in, but actually, where are people going to eat their lunch? How's that going to be for people? And touch, what is it that we're going to expect people to be doing? So are we doing activities with plasticine, and how's that going to impact people? Are we doing things where we're going to ask people to touch each other, and what's that going to be like for people? And it's not just necessarily the kind of actual, you know, touching of something. It's also about temperature. What temperature is the room? What are the chairs like? What are the tables like? What's the surface of the tables like? What's the textures that are involved? All of those sorts of things all come into it. So kind of really broadening it out.
Yeah, I love that. I think these are interesting to hear because I think they're so often overlooked. Like you turn up to a session and it's going to be like, well, we're doing this big group sheet together on a table, but does that work for everyone? What is the physical environment? So yeah, I think those are really important because they're things people will just assume that don't need to be considered, or they're the standard, so they won't deviate from that, or those kind of issues pop up. Going to get to a few of the questions from the chat, but I just wanted to segue nicely from that whole point of context. Where is someone going to be when they're trying to do this? Training also applies to when we create resources, when we create learning experience. So I know you mentioned some of those design principles earlier around backgrounds, fonts, but are there other things to consider when we're creating maybe our video resources we're putting into courses, our learning sort of job aids or step-by-step guides? Are there some sort of like ground rules that would work for people to take away and apply?
So again, it's the flexibility. I did some training a little while ago, and the only way that you could do the training was to watch a video. And it was a video that somebody had recorded with not the best microphone, so it sounded a bit tinny and a bit echoey. It was an ISO accreditation type, so it was dry and there was lots of technical jargon, and there was no subtitles, there was no alternative format. Now, we might be somebody that loves a video. We might be somebody that really likes to be able to listen to something, just pop it on the side, but that doesn't mean everybody is, even if it's as simple as a transcript. So if that person doesn't want to have to read it, they've got a transcript. Are you putting subtitles on? One of the things I see a lot for kind of, and I know this isn't necessarily learning, but LinkedIn, people will put their own subtitles on, and then LinkedIn will put subtitles on in exactly the same place. And so then you've got the clash of two different sets of subtitles. So just as simple as that, thinking that through, thinking about that user experience at the end, what's this going to be like for somebody to try and interact with?
Yeah, there is a little box right at the bottom of LinkedIn when you upload a video now that says add subtitles. And if you've already added subtitles and forget to untick that box, then it is rather hellish trying to watch those videos. So that's, I'm glad I'm not the only one plagued by that. But just on that point, actually, I think the tech has never been simpler to do that. There's so many free transcription tools. If you've seen a YouTube video that's helpful, you can natively clip sections of a YouTube video and just send that to people. The tech is really there. You could even, without bringing up the dreaded AI, there's ways you could ask it to automate something, or even the prompt could be, look, can you put this in a more reader-friendly format? If it's like a really long resource, right, you could say, make sure there's no paragraphs longer than 50 words. And then we could ask it to break it out. So I do think that there's a lot more scope there for tech to help people ensure that they're following those basic ground rules that will make every learning experience a bit better.
Absolutely. I used a common chat tool recently. Other tools are available. And I asked it to reword something so that it'd be appropriate for a 10-year-old to read. And it was for me to read it. It was the fact that somebody had sent me this really long waffly thing. And I thought, I'm never going to read that. And so I did, and it worked perfectly. So you're absolutely right. There are so many ways. I think even with that, we just have to bear in mind that our preference might not be somebody else's. So, just because we like to have little segments of YouTube videos pulled out, we still need to have that flexibility and that empathy that might not be somebody else's ideal way of working.
Yeah, I think it comes back to that individual thing. If I see a podcast that I know will be helpful to you for your role, it's just like what quickly ask you, what's the best way for you do you want to listen to the whole thing? Would you prefer I just timestamp the bit that was useful to you. So yeah, I think it comes back to, like you said earlier, there will never be one size fits all. So just make sure you're really speaking to people and understanding on an individual basis what it is that will help them. Cool. We've got, this time has absolutely flown by, Hayley. We've got 10 minutes left. So I do want to come back to a couple of questions from the chat. And then if anyone else has a question, feel free to drop it in. We'll just come back to the second follow-up question Kurt asked earlier, but do you think it's okay to sort of expect people or put onus on them to self-advocate, because we might not have the confidence as a learner or know what the right mechanism or channel is to share that? And also we don't want to offend the person training, because they're obviously got their, there's a lot on their plate, I guess, in that situation.
I think it's a great question. And no, I don't think it's okay to expect self-advocating in as abrupt a manner as that. We can't just expect that everybody's going to walk into our room. I always say, Sims, where they have the little thing above their head. I'm like, people aren't going to walk in and be like, I got a purple thing above my head, but I got a green thing above my head. It doesn't work like that. So no, we don't expect learners to self-advocate. What we do is we create an environment and we invite learners to self-advocate. We invite learners to tell us what we can do to make it better for them. So kind of bringing in both questions together, what can the learner do? Well, the learner can think about what they need to get out of the session, what's going to help them, and they can share that information. They can not rely on the trainer mind reading. What does the trainer need to do in order for that to happen? Well, the trainer needs to create the culture where that's appropriate. They need to do, like I mentioned earlier, that kind of pre-work that says, please bring, whatever's going to help you. And we don't have to frame it in terms of, if you're neurodivergent or have a specific learning need. We can literally frame it as, I want to make sure you get the best out of today. Please let me know in advance anything that's going to help you. And I'll ask this question again on the day. We can have a little box on the table and some post-it notes, and we can ask everybody in the room, so that we're being inclusive, we're bringing everybody in. We can ask everybody to write on a post-it note what's going to help them get the best out of the day, pop it all into the box anonymously, and then we can go through that and we can say, right, these are the things that are going to help all of us have a really good day today, have a really good session today. Yeah. Obviously, you could use a Jamboard or something if you're doing that virtually. So does that add the context needed? That no, I'm not telling you go out and expect every learner to come in with, a placard of these are the things that I must have.
Yeah. Do that's a great point that comes back to something you said earlier, but icebreakers at the start of a session, like that's just such an arbitrary thing. But would 5-10 minutes spent doing the exercise you just mentioned help for a better session? Absolutely. Like if I understand what we have set the ground rules for how we're going to run the session and what's going to work for everyone, that's far better than me having to tell you that my fun fact is that when they transported the KFC recipe, they sent 49 other decoy recipes so that they wouldn't find the correct 12 herbs and spices, which is the one I always use because I don't have an interesting fact about myself. Cool. I'm just going to read this one again verbatim because there's a lot of great context in it. So a question from Clement in the chat. The dilemma in L&D is about knowing your audience, understanding the pain points and the ways they learn before you launch into any initiatives, but we don't always know whether people have that level of awareness. So the question is, would you say that creating the environment should come first, so that light, the context design and the space that you mentioned earlier? Or should we try and help our people identify potential challenges that might be linked to their neurodiversity? And do you have any experience with that? So yeah, would it be, I guess it's probably a middle ground, but yeah, what should we do? Try and create the environment first, or try and do that sort of discovery process with our people first?
You are both. It's both. Sorry, you are right. It's both of the things. There's the balance. So if we have the overall environment that's going to work for everybody, actually what you're going to pick up is those people who wouldn't quite meet a threshold for a diagnosis. You're going to get those people who don't realise that they're neurodivergent, that realise but don't want to share. You're gonna be able to meet their needs. In terms of individuals identifying for themselves, that can be really, really helpful, and both in a learning environment, but also just in life in general. But what we don't want to do is get into a way of working where somebody has to come with their certificate for us to then give them a good, if somebody comes and says, I don't know why, but having it on green paper works for me, actually, can we just put it on green paper? Because it doesn't really matter why that works better for them. It's going to work better. And whether that's because they're a learner in our environment, whether that's because they're a direct report in our team, whatever it might be, ultimately, we want everybody to get the best out of everything they're doing. We want people to produce their best work. We want people to have the best learning experiences. So what we shouldn't do is get too hung up on using diagnosis as a mechanism to be able to put things into place. We want to be able to have environments where we can put things into place regardless. But sometimes it can be helpful to have that extra context added in.
Cool. Perfect. Yeah, thanks for sharing, Hayley. I think that point around, you made it earlier, my reality is not your reality. We don't need to often dig deeper. I find it awkward sometimes. It will be like a one-to-one or a question, like a conversation where it's, oh, I don't feel that motivated at the moment. Why? And then there's some sort of pressure to come to a resolution of why. It's like, you don't always know why in those conversations. So sometimes you just got to be like, listen in that sense and draw a line under it. I think we've got time for one more from Benita. And again, I'm just going to read this verbatim, but neurodiversity has been labeled as a trend due to social media, showing a lot of content around it. This can have a bit of an eye roll effect from some more old school and traditional thinkers if they're in the senior leadership team or the C-suite, and that can influence the buy-in that you get to build that better culture. So do you have any advice for L&D professionals to ensure it's top of mind, but also beyond that superficial way, and also so that people in the senior team can make decisions, buy into it as well?
Yeah. So here you're going to need to know your audience. You're going to know which kind of things are going to motivate them to get on board. Some places it's all going to be about profit. There's a Harvard Business Review article that talks about why neuro-inclusion is good for profit. So basically go and use that and make that be kind of your business case. You've got things like CIPD have put out a resource which looks at the legality side of neuro-inclusion and why it's really good from that perspective. So there's another angle. One of the things about the whole trend that I like to share with people is that actually, if we go back to Tudor times, so that's quite a long time ago, even in Tudor times, there was references to neurodivergence. So we had court gestures who were abrupt, blunt, honest, unable to lie. We had people with what was called hyperkinetic disorder or hyperkinetic syndrome who were constantly on the go coming up with new stuff. There's a fabulous point, which is, when we first started to be very conscious about doing things as a human as opposed to as an animal, we started to use tools and resources in different ways to how we found them. That very first stone spear, that would have been created by somebody repeatedly bashing one rock with another rock. Do you think that was a neurotypical person that repeatedly bashed one rock with another rock because they could see that something was going to happen? We don't know. None of us were actually there to be able to prove that point. We don't even know actually who created that first stone spear. But that concept of cognitive diversity, of neurodiversity, goes back so far that yes, we may be raising awareness, we might be talking about it more, we might have broken that taboo and that stigma and that shame and all of those things that for years have been what kept the lid on it all. But that doesn't mean it's new. It doesn't mean that it's just, suddenly come from nowhere and that it's like Barbie. It's something that has really been around for as long as we've been around, and that is all of us. And so you've got the legal perspective, you've got the business perspective, you've got the moral perspective, and then you've got the human, the right thing to do kind of perspective. Depending on your audience, depending on the industry you're in, depending on the environment you're in, depends on which angle you're probably going to need to take to create that buy-in. But I would say there's always light at the end of the tunnel to get there.
Cool. Perfect. Yeah, makes sense. Let's do one very final one, because I know a few people need to drop off, but I guess it's about how do we balance the diversity of learning preferences? Obviously we might hear 10 different things from other people about how they will prefer to learn that might be very different. So is there any advice on how we can provide balance but still support people?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
paraphrase that one a bit, is to say, like, you know, some people might say that they have that green paper example. Some people might love role plays. Some people might say that they're best to just watch a video in their own time, I think is the sort of extra context I left off. But how do we make sure I guess is it realistic to cater to every preference, or do we need to maybe strike a balance sometimes? And how do we do that? Because obviously a lot of people join into, they might be single person L&D teams, and there's probably a limit to what they can do, I guess, is more of the question.
Fab. So I think do as much as you can, be realistic, and create the space that you can invite people to let you know everything over. That doesn't mean that you have to rock up to every single training session with, here's it on red paper, here's it on green paper, here's it on blue paper, here's it. What you might do is, if you're happy to facilitate that, is have something in the join-in that says, I'm happy to bring the resources on different colour paper, but you need to give me a week's notice for me to be able to do that. So you can balance it that way. There's also the difference, we're all going to have preferences. And if we talk about noise, I've not met anybody yet, I'm not saying it's not going to happen one day, that enjoys listening to somebody else eat crisps. If that's you, please put your hand up now.
Doesn't exist.
However, Rosie likes it. Rosie loves to hear somebody eat crisps. However, I have met people for whom listening to somebody eat crisps is such a dysphoric experience that it makes them feel emotionally dysregulated. It makes them feel physically sick. It makes them feel like their ears are hurting. And that's the difference. We've probably all got a preference to not have to listen to somebody eat crisps, apart from Rosie. But for some people, actually, that's no longer about preference. That's about regulation, sensory regulation, emotional regulation, feeling safe, feeling comfortable, feeling like you can just be in that space. And I guess that's where that balance comes in. And I'd love to tell you that there's this perfect black and white line in between, but I'm afraid there isn't. There's all sorts of shades of not just grey, but everything else as well, that mean that it is sometimes a bit more challenging to unpick. And we do need to kind of go as far as we can, but also understand that we're not superhuman ourselves. We can only do what we can do. And it's about, really, the overarch is that environment that says, I'll help you as much as I can, but sometimes, you know, you might not be able to put in place. And then it's about, how do you handle that?
Perfect. Yeah, great note to end on. That it really is no silver bullet, and it is about understanding people and balance. Loads of love in the chat from people. Some people had to drop off at 12 exactly, but they left some great notes about how useful the session had been. Hayley, Rosie's confirmed that she doesn't enjoy the sound of people eating crisps in the chat. For me, it's apples. That's worse than crisps. If I can hear someone eating an apple, that's going to drive me wild. But yeah, loads of great love in the chat. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us, for leaving so many great questions and interactions, and being so open with your experiences in the chat. Hayley, what we'll do in the post-show notes and also the description of the podcast episode for people on demand, leave links to where people can find you on LinkedIn and the Great Minds Don't website. But yeah, I guess just thank you for joining us, and it is a great pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all, everybody.
Before you head off, I want to tell you about two very exciting things. Deaf of the LMS, your free guide to Skills First L&D is now live. From the numbers that explain L&D's current problems to lessons on how you can build a skills-led strategy, this is going to help you drive more impact through learning. You'll find the link right at the top of this episode's description. And just below that, a link to our new weekly walkthrough, where we show you how this can be done in practice and give you a tour of how now. Our learning experience platform that gets 5 times more engagement than a traditional LMS. So, thanks for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again for another episode of the podcast.